So thank you to our two speakers. We have a number of microphones if people want to step up to the microphone. And again, I'm really encouraging people that maybe ordinarily don't come up to the microphone, please do that. We have a lot of organizers in the room, I know. And I think we should be thinking about how we're going to be moving forward with new ideas about organizing into the future, since this is a different kind of population that we're really talking about, right? So I think Hamilton and Angus both gave us a good idea of what the need is out there and some of the stories. And it's up to us, I guess, to develop some of the opportunities that we can use here to move forward. So obviously one of the big challenges is that we have multiple employers for a lot of people. And I wonder if either of you want to comment on just going forward about this idea of multiple employers and also of building alliances and coalitions with students or other faculty members, and then we can start to take a couple questions. Either one of you want to comment on that?
I'd kind of like to just turn it over. Okay. Yeah, I feel like there's stuff that I could say, but...
Okay, why don't we start over here?
Hi, I'm Bob Noonan. I'm president of the Montclair State Adjunct Union. We have 1,200 adjuncts. We have a separate full-time AFT union, too, who we work very closely with. But on the panel before and in this panel, this question of the term, the blurring of the lines, that's the problem. I'm not so sure they're blurred. I mean, the problem is that as we sometimes, I haven't spent 3 years sitting in the back of the university senate asking for representation for half of the people, for the people that teach more than half the students in the school. That's probably a low number for many universities. I finally got to sit on the university senate, and the big pushback was this concept of collegiality, which we were infringing upon. And yet, I have very good relationships with these people, but how this alliance, this blurring of the lines, this concept of raised previously on the York thing of an idea of an individual. I know that there's laws in California that allow some of this to gain seniority to move up, so there's hope, and we become less contingent, and there are career lines. Have to do with us finding a way for the full-time faculty and the adjunct faculty and our new group, the in-between faculty, who are the non-tenure track people. I have, in one example, my only great success story, I have other success stories, of an individual we got to be a non-tenure track person because she had a PhD and spoke 4 languages and was running our dig in Rome, and just this year became a tenure track. That's a wonderful story, but it's extremely rare. So how do we get this alliance going? Right. How do we get rid of this idea? Let's go back to the 70% tenured faculty days. You know, they were so wonderful. It's not going to happen. So what do we do in between?
That's a great question. I think there are a few pieces to the answer. I think one thing is that there is your discussion of adjunct involvement in governance is something that's, I think, really, really important and really crucial to this, because on the one hand, with adjunct faculty being excluded from governance, there is this feeling that they're not real faculty, right? That we are not real professors. On the other hand, if I'm getting paid per credit hour and you ask me to sit on a committee or to sit on the faculty senate, that's unpaid labor on my part. That's an additional burden for me, which further immiserates me, right? It reduces the amount that I'm being paid per hour considerably further. And I am one of these folks who has outside work, both during the school year and outside. And so, time that I am spending sitting on a committee is time that I could be spending doing, professional freelance copy editing or whatever it else is, or speaking on a campus. Bring me to speak on your campus. So I think that's a tough nut to crack, right? Because on the one hand, we want to be treated with that respect, but on the other hand, it is further damaging us financially. I do think that an important part of that has to do with what faculty who are in a non-precarious position, the respect that they treat their colleagues with, pushing to find office space for us, pushing to create ways in which we will be seen as members of the faculty is an important part. Honestly, I'll admit that I wouldn't have always said yes to something like this. I tended not to describe myself as an adjunct for a long time. It's been a process over the last couple of years of sort of coming out of the closet as a full-time permanent adjunct. Because as somebody who has a little bit of, visibility in the public at large, I always worry about that. I always worry about what it's going to do with my reputation, because I am an adjunct not by choice. And so, the more that we can do to create environments on the campus where we're treated like and respected as real faculty. That's not a complete answer to your question, but I've gone on for a very long time, so I'll stop there.
I guess I would just add that I really think that adjuncts ultimately are going to have to either educate or shame full-time faculty into being their serious, strong allies, because adjuncts alone just don't have the leverage to get it done. But as a group, all the faculty has a lot of leverage. All the faculty plus the students have a lot of leverage. It's obviously very easy for the full-time tenured faculty to ignore the adjuncts, but they're going to have to do some uncomfortable arm twisting and yelling until that unity happens, I think.
Hi, my name is Maggie Cohen. I'm an adjunct at one university, but I want to talk about the one where I'm essentially a chief organizer for SEIU Local 500. I used to work for 27 years for the University of Maryland University College, which at one time was a dignified and noble organization that catered to working adults and military members overseas, and has since taken Phoenix as its model. At any rate, I was on the shared governance body for 5 years, on the system, and we are I came to this conference because I need advice, because our situation at UMUC is very special, unique, and difficult. We have no tenure or tenure-track people. 90% or so of our classes are taught by adjuncts. Probably about 85% of our classes are online. Our students are older students with children and grandchildren and so on, and they're scattered. We used to have faculty meetings where locals could come and meet each other and talk. They've been abolished. The Governance Council has been abolished. We have petitioned the state and gotten the okay from the Board of Regents to no longer be under state personnel or procurement regulations. We have become essentially a corporation that has no connection with an interest in quality education. But my job is to try to bring together these atomized, isolated, scared faculty who into some kind of community and some kind of union. Nobody has job security. There are no rules about appointments or reappointments, and we have to reach out to them. We have a big mix. We have a mix of those people that are patching together a living from working for UMUC, and UMUC does have a pretty high rate. That is, our highest rate is $4,600 a course, which is exceptional. But the problem is that there are a lot of people coming out of business and government and retirement to teach because they want to teach and need a few extra bucks. And then there are other people who need it to earn a living. So
about how to work with a diverse group of adjuncts in a union, or to unionize them, to organize them?
The question is, if anybody has experience, I mean, everything has to be done online. And we have this diverse group, and we're not even sure who's who. We never see each other. Our students, who we really need, because the quality of education of UMUC is in the toilet now.
Great. So why don't we get some comments from the panelists
Anybody
about
who
this?
has any experience, please come to me. I need all the help I can get.
It's a tough setup, obviously, but one thing I always recommend is going straight to the media. I mean, the PR is a great tool, and probably the strongest tool that people like you have. I mean, you can start a Facebook group for everybody, you can moderate it, you can do your best to pull everybody together, but write those op-eds, write an op-ed for Inside Higher Ed, write an op-ed for the Chronicle. I mean, bring some sort of pressure to bear. Keep, just keep at it. But that's a tough situation. Yeah.
It's an incredibly difficult situation, and it's a situation we're all going to be facing more and more as we move forward. So if you do get good suggestions from anybody else in this room, and there's a lot of people who are a lot more experienced in labor organizing than I am here, be sure to let me know what folks tell you. But I do agree that I think a piece of the puzzle is getting people together online. There's one of the things about forging connections between people online is that they can then be boosted into face-to-face connections. That once we make connections with each other in an online setting, whether it's a Facebook group or by Twitter or mailing list or whatever it is, we feel like we know each other, right? And then once you say, well, we're all going to get together for a beer or whatever it is, there is more of an impetus for people to get together face to face. Sometimes online connections are derided as weak link ties. That's something that's been written a lot about in the past. But every tie begins as a weak link tie. And I see you skeptical, and I recognize that it's not a complete answer. No, absolutely. Absolutely. But I think that doing taking the steps to try and figure out how to begin the conversations, and then you have an opportunity to deepen them and broaden them. And as you suggest, some of them are going to stay online relationships. But as somebody with 21,000 Twitter followers, I've got a lot of folks who I've never met who I have very powerful, strong relationships with that are entirely online relationships, and real organizing has come out of some of those relationships.
Let me raise another notion, and maybe people can comment from the audience or from the panel too. But in Philadelphia, we have a model really of developing a union that is metro-wide, that is across universities. Angus talked about really teaching almost full-time as an adjunct in one institution. And we see some of that, but it's much more likely that we see adjuncts teaching in several institutions. And the notion that we're having in Philadelphia is really developing a community of scholars, a community of instructors and teachers that are connected through their union, and where they happen to do the work that they do can be in very many different locations. So I'm wondering too, and maybe the two of you could comment on this, about Hamilton, if you've heard examples of that from adjuncts, and also Angus, in your experience about organizing and building alliances and relationships to do that across universities and to do that with people having something in common, which is the work that they do, no matter where they do it. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is an issue in a lot of industries today. I mean, the traditional union model of the shop model and the employer being the basis for organizing is breaking down to a certain extent across a ton of industries because of the way that work is today. Academia is one of those industries, as you mentioned, and so there are new models. There are worker centers and affinity groups and things like that, probably. But ultimately, I still think that the most power can be brought to bear institution by institution. And so I think that worker centers and those sort of cross-school groups are great as far as they go. But when you get down to things like trying to shift the percentage of tenured faculty that a school will agree to have and things like that, those are battles that are still probably going to have to be fought institution by institution.
I agree with that, but I also think that in terms of doing the initial work of organizing, as you were talking about, and more broadly, a flip side of this dispersal and diffusion of labor is that folks are isolated. And they feel that isolation as a lack. I wrote down one of the things that Randy said, that our job in the next 4 years is to create community, to create trust. And I remember way back when I was in grad school, I was taking a class on the history of social movements, and there was a discussion about where these social movements sprung from. And the professor in the class, Blanche Cook, said, people, first of all, want to connect with one another. people, first of all, want to connect with one another. And I wrote that down in my notebook, and I tore it out of the notebook when I got home, and I put it on my bulletin board, and 4 or 5 bulletin boards later, it's still hanging up above my desk. People want to connect with one another. It's not the only thing that takes people into social organizing and it's movement organizing, and it's not, in many cases, not the primary thing, but it is a core need that people have. And if we can satisfy that need as organizers, if we can feed that lack, that is one of the things that we can give people and one of the ways that we can bring people together.
Yeah, and I think we see particularly with adjuncts this sense of isolation, right? And this sense of alone, and you can hear it in the comments that Hamilton was referring to, their kind of people feeling defeated too, and like there's something wrong with them too. But we have another question.
Good morning. Tenured academic jobs are great jobs, and very understandably, once people have obtained them, they often like to hold on to them for as long as they possibly can because of all the sort of freedoms and the prestige that those jobs offer. However, in many public professions, they enforce mandatory retirement ages, which creates a throughfare and creates a space for younger, newer people to come through. I wondered if mandatory retirement was part of the discussion at all, and if you had any thoughts on that.
So your question is about whether it's, whether it's a retirement issue, making space for younger workers, or if there's an issue about how the work has changed and how people are now being hired in institutions, perhaps.
I personally, I think I'm not a fan of mandatory retirement ages, and I'm certainly not a fan of it as an organizing strategy. It's hard enough to get folks on your side without saying, well, what we need to do is take away one of the things that you like most about your job, and that's how we're going to achieve the revolution. And come on board, join us. One of the things that I had written down in my comments that I didn't get to is I think we need to move away from this idea that we're working on a zero-sum game in all sorts of ways. I think that the idea that adjunct faculty benefit by tearing down tenured or tenure track faculty, that students and faculty's interests diverge. I think that's a mistake. I think that we become stronger by building each other up. And I think that the list of ways in which I would improve access to the tenure track lines and to improve quality of life for folks who are never going to be on the tenure track lines, mandatory retirement, it would be very, very low on my list of ways of achieving that.
Yeah, I guess I would add that, like you said, mandatory retirement is a little bit like taking from the faculty to feed another part of the faculty, whereas you need to take from the institution instead. And one thing that I heard from a lot of adjuncts was complaints about the number of administrators and the salaries of administrators. And that's a section of higher education that has been booming lately, and that's probably a more fruitful place to look for savings of money than mandatory retirement.
And it doesn't seem like there's less jobs. It seems like there's more of a conversion of full-time positions to part-time positions, and even the full-time positions to insecure full-time positions. So more people are contingent than they are in tenured positions. Yes.
So I'm Jerome Dantzis. I'm a retired professor of mathematics from the University of Maryland, and I thought this is, and I sort of have a footnote, but my impression is that for state universities in the 80s, the states supplied about 3/4 of the budgets, and by 2005 it was down to 1/4. And since 2005, of course, it's dropped. With the Great Recession, it's dropped even more. One way that state universities have coped with this is by less jobs, and with two ways. One is that you can have a non-tenured track people. Well, let's say person teaching twice as many courses as a tenure track person, and so that
So not so much less jobs, but less funding for the jobs? So is your question about
there's
the
less
funding from the states?
No, there's definitely less jobs. I know I will say specifically in my math department in 1990, there were 87 faculty and let's say 10 lecturers. And now there's just 55 faculty and there's 20 lecturers.
Okay. So does somebody want to comment on the shifts in the workforce in higher education at this point?
Well, one thing that is crazy is that at the time when this has been happening, the decline in funding of higher education from the government, at the same time we had this creation of this huge underclass of workers in higher education. So obviously, there's a disconnect there, and the burden of that lack of funding should not be on the backs of this class of adjuncts who are living in poverty. The burden should be transferred into the cost of schools, which would outrage everybody who wants to go to college, which then hopefully would translate into better funding at the end of the day.
Well, and just to piggyback on that, I think it's also worth noting that at the same time that funding for colleges and universities has declined, the average student is getting poorer, right? So tuition is going up at exactly the time that students are less able to pay those high tuitions. And one of the things that we see as a result is that students have a lot less freedom to pursue the careers they want to pursue the course of education they want to pursue. Also, they have a lot less freedom to become involved in activism and in protest on campus. One of the things that spurred some of the student movements of the 1960s was a sense that when you get out, you're going to land on your feet. And so, college is a time for experimentation. College is a time for trying various different things. And if you're, liable to be drafted, college is a time to extend as long as possible so that you can avoid going to Vietnam. And so, one of the things that always leaps out to me is how incredibly brave and how incredibly inspiring the current generation of student activists is, because they are doing this in the teeth of incredible economic challenges that are facing them, not only when they get out, but while they're still on campus, because they've got, they're working while they're trying to organize and go to school at the same time.
So we've heard a little bit, the need for organizing. What do you see, maybe both of you, as the way forward in terms of organizing? We've talked a little bit about the model in Philadelphia where we're trying to build a metro-wide local. We have other schools. Obviously, there's been a great demand and interest in unionizing among adjuncts. But what do you see as the most effective path forward to organizing and to really confronting some of the issues that we are confronted with in higher education right now?
Well, I'll ride my hobby horse about student-faculty alliances just a little bit farther as I go off into the sunset. One of the things I want to stress about that is what these student-faculty alliances are going to need to look like. One of the things that disturbs me a lot is the current habit of treating students as being illiberal, as being opponents of free speech, as being censorious, all of those kinds of things. And I think that one of the things that is undergirding that is that there is a sense from a lot of student activists that they are engaging in free speech when they engage in these protests, and that what happens is that they get attacked as enemies of free speech. And so there's a lot of people out there wondering, well, why don't these students see free speech as more of a virtue? Why don't they see it as a core value? Well, because nobody's out there saying the First Amendment defends you. Nobody's out there saying that your rights to protest are defended by the First Amendment. And so even if I think you're kind of dopey, and frankly, many of us who are older are going to think that the students are kind of dopey every once in a while, I am still going to have your back. I am still going to support you because I believe in the importance of protest, I believe in the importance of organizing, and I believe in the First Amendment. And so and with the advent of this new political era that we're entering into, It frankly scares me because I'm looking at a future in which fascists' ability to speak on campus is being protected more than students' ability to protest those fascists. And I don't think that that's leading us anywhere good. So I think we really do need to have the students' backs far more than we have.
Yeah, I mean, organizing is the way forward, and it's the only way forward, I think. And I would broaden it a little bit and say, Adjunct professors are one group of workers who have seen an explosion of organizing fairly recently because there's just been a lot of activity in that area. Digital media, the industry that I'm in, has seen a wave of unionization in the past year. And there are industries across America that are virtually untouched by unions, that are low-hanging fruit for unions, that are waiting to be organized. I mean, my industry, half of the industry has organized in the past year, and it's just because people started trying to organize us, and it worked. And if unions need to see this as an emergency, what's happening. If you look at a chart of union membership, and it's been going down for 40 years, and we're getting down to pretty close to single digits now, I mean, that has to be turned around. And if it is not turned around, things are going to get worse and worse and worse. And I really think that within the union world and within the labor world at large, because obviously there are different models, there needs to be a sense of crisis right now and say, we need to organize people, we need to draw people into the concept of organized labor, and if we don't, we're going to have some dark times ahead.
Well, I'd like to thank Hamilton and Angus for participating in the panel. Thank you.
So I don't know if we supply stewed coffee, because I don't know what stewed coffee is. But we do have lunch for you all, and we did this setup so that you could come back in and have some conversation with yourself and your associated friends on what we're discussing. So the lunch is ready. And we will reconvene in here in about 45 minutes.